So the next speaker is online. Unfortunately, the train was cancelled. So the next speaker is Professor Anthony Lehmann from the University of Geneva in Switzerland, the Institute for Environmental Science and enviroSPACE Lab. Initially, Anthony studied aquatic plants, and then he moved to the analysis of ecosystemic services. So, Anthony, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, hello everyone. Sorry for not being with you today. It's against my will, but I followed the discussion so far and it was really interesting. My title today is Building the Climate, Food, Water, Energy Ecosystem Nexus for Guiding Sustainable Development, a quite ambitious title and endeavor. And I will explain how, if I manage to change my slides, yes. My background indeed is in ecology, and I started on aquatic plants, but also studied other organisms, plants and animals. And somehow what I want to do today is take you on my own journey on building from looking at species and conservation of individual species towards integrating information to assess more complex socio-ecological systems. So it's not only my journey, it's in fact the journey of conservation science in the last 50 years. If we look at this paper by Georgina Mace, who identify how the framing of nature conservation has changed from in the 60s, 70s. The idea was to protect biodiversity and ecosystem for themselves by creating protected area, for instance. And then we realized that we needed to protect nature despite people because of all the threats of human activities, pollutions, among others. That was already a shift. And then in the 2000, we looked into indeed assessing the value of biodiversity through the services that it provides to our well-being, quite an anthropocentric approach. And then now in the more recent years, we are really looking at integrating our knowledge on biodiversity with our society through socio-ecological system and somehow protecting nature and people, which is kind of similar to the One Health approach. So indeed, in order to reach sustainable development goals, we'll need healthy ecosystems. We can see in these two pictures how on the left, a healthy ecosystem is providing income, climate mitigation, health through medicines, protecting biodiversity itself, food, and clean water, where degraded ecosystems will probably be much more efficient at providing all these services to reach sustainable goals. So it's very important that we keep healthy ecosystem in numbers and large areas of our planet. So I want to take you through this journey step by step. It's my own kind of endeavor. By looking first at this assessment of ecosystem services, which was made really popular through the publication in the years 2005 of the so-called Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from the United Nations, where for the first time really it was put forward the idea that ecosystem services were providing quite obviously provisioning services, providing food, fresh water, wood and fibers and fuel, but also regulating services to regulate our climate, floods, diseases, and water purification, but also cultural services, which are less obvious to look at and monitor through the value, aesthetic value of landscape, or spiritual value that people can put in parts of nature, and also recreational aspects of being happy to do things in nature. And all these services that will benefit our well-being are supported by the nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production. So this concept of ecosystem services was really made very popular in 2005 with this, it existed before, but it was made popular with this report. And the report also looked at linking those services to our well-being in different indicators that were provided here. So, and then somehow 10 years or so later, Costanza in 2017 did an assessment of 20 years of research on ecosystem services. And we see on this first picture that those services are provided by nature, the natural capital, but it's only when connected to human built and social capital that through interactions, they contribute to our well-being, not a direct link. So in order to assess and understand these ecosystem services, we need to look more into how things are functioning in a complex socio-ecological system, where on the left, we find again this natural capital with all the different functions, and then the services that they provide in terms of cultural, regulating, provisioning services, and then they enter our more socio-economical system on the right that contribute to our well-being. And then depending on how we feel about the changes in our well-being, will probably create responses to go back and modify the way we manage nature. So now we know what are ecosystem services, and the thing is to know how we can potentially evaluate, assess them. So in fact, the story went really quickly from this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005 to the creation of the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, in the year 2015. It's the equivalent of the IPCC or GIEC panel for climate, where here, through a conceptual framework, we really try to bridge the gap between science and policy for biodiversity and ecosystem services, looking first at in nature, how we can assess biodiversity and ecosystem, how they contribute to these ecosystem services, and then to human well-being, and then also look at the direct and indirect drivers of change, and also the policy response to this framework. And we look at that through time and through different spatial scales. So one of the first reports of this IPBES was about creating and providing data and models to be able to assess ecosystem services. So on the right here, we see the framework that I just mentioned, and how scenarios and models feed into this big framework. And more practically speaking, we see a workflow from the data available and knowledge towards the decision making here on the left side, and through the creation of scenarios of plausible futures that will modify our assessment of different ecosystem services. And this is done to support and explore possible futures and inform decision makers. So here's an example of the implementation of such approach that was proposed by IPBES in a small catchment area in Thailand here, where we have two scenarios: a conservation scenario of land use change, which is not changing much in this case, compared to a development scenario where a part of the forest is transformed into settlements or agriculture. And the service that is at stake here measured is a sediment loss from the soil through the erosion of precipitation, with different also climate scenarios here. So we see that in the development scenarios here, the sediment loss is much higher, whatever the climate scenario we use compared to the conservation scenario. So this is just one example of one ecosystem services assessed through this combination of scenario and models to inform policy making about this particular problem. So now, in order to bring the data and the models that we need to create the assessment of ecosystem services and engage with policymakers in this kind of virtual loop here, we need data and models, and here's a list of a few of them available that has been created in the last 20 years as well. And particularly INVEST here is a toolbox that allow you to map and assess about 17 different ecosystem services. And we need data as well. And as ecosystem services are dependent on living organisms and ecosystems, we need data from the biodiversity field. And we need to know what needs to be measured on a regular basis to do the monitoring of biodiversity from in situ or remote sensing sources to inform our decision for different policies on the Convention on Biodiversity or towards the IPBES as well. And in the middle there, you have this boxes defined as essential biodiversity variables that the biodiversity community has defined to make sure that we are measuring these different characteristics of biodiversity on a regular basis through time so that we can build information systems and indicator systems on a long base. So this is in fact, the example from biodiversity, but it was borrowed from climate, which were the first community to create essential climate variables. And then also now the water community is defining essential water variables. And through a European project that we coordinated recently, we have been promoting the use of this concept of essential variables in other fields because we think it's very important that this data is made available in each domain to inform their own policies at different scale, European or global scale, or even national as well. And then all this data can feed into SDG indicators to track our progresses towards these indicators, these goals. So with this, we need also workflows, processes, programs to transform this, again, this raw data into efficient indicators to inform policy makers and to be able to do that quickly. So, sorry, in this European project, we tried to define what should be these essential variables. So we can define the Earth system, and I mentioned with essential biodiversity variable, which exists now, atmospheric climate variables, hydrospheres, and the geospheres, which is also developed quite well. So somehow defining the Earth system is quite developed with essential variables, but the socioeconomical system is less so. And we also need to look at essential variables in all these different bubbles in order to have long-lasting sources of data to look at how our socio-ecological systems are functioning at different scales. So now a few examples of how ecosystem services have been assessed, starting with the first global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services done in 2019 by the IPBES, which resulted in the assessment of about 18 different ecosystem services here in the different types of regulation, material, and cultural services, which in the last 50 years that we see here, all of them almost were going down quite drastically. And a few of them were going back up, but they are essentially material services. We have been using more resources from the environment in terms of energy, food, and material to the detriment of other services and biodiversity. And in this report, they also use this concept of scenarios and explore the future of these ecosystem services through 3 scenarios: the global sustainability, regional competition, and economic optimism, and look at averages of assessment of biodiversity in orange, material ecosystem services in purple, and regulating ecosystem services in white. And we see that, for instance, in different regions of the world, usually when we exploit more material services, it's to the expense of biodiversity and regulating services. So they're clearly a trade-off. The more we use those material services from nature, the more we deteriorate the ecosystems and the biodiversity. So this concept of ecosystem services also shows us that it is important to protect ecosystems and nature. And how do we do that? One way that has been implemented across Europe is the concept of, here we see again the concept of ecosystem services proposed by European Environmental Agency. And that gave also the development of a report to assess ecosystem services and across Europe, and then also to see how and where this biodiversity and ecosystem services was most important, and to propose so-called ecological infrastructure of Europe, where we identify hotspot of ecosystem services, but also key habitat that could and should be restored to look and define the ecological infrastructure at European scale. Switzerland being a little hole in the map there, unfortunately, and yeah, always annoying when I see that as a geographer. And that's an example from Europe, but more locally in Geneva, we are kind of following the same step. And this is a picture from our local biodiversity strategy that was promoted a few years ago, where the different goals that we have here are all encompassed by the first goal, which is building this ecological infrastructure. So we had a very interesting collaboration with the state of Geneva to look at what data we had available. And I mentioned ecosystem services here. I mentioned biodiversity, the composition of species, animal and plants. But we looked also at the structure of the landscape and also some of its function, essentially connectivity that we could assess through maps. And the idea is that we try to map all of these, the biodiversity, the ecosystem services, the structure and the function of our ecosystem in the state of Geneva. And through a tool of prioritization called zonation, given different weights that we can define with our policymakers, identify again the area most interesting for protecting biodiversity and ecosystem services, structure and functions. So if we zoom on this map, we see here the state of Geneva, the city of Geneva at the end of the lake, and until the year 2020, the aim was to protect 17% of terrestrial landscape following the Convention on Biodiversity ICI targets. But more recently, this same CBD organization in Montreal last December extended this aim to protect 30% by 2030. So we can add here 13%. And if we look at this dark purple plus the pink areas, these corresponds to the most important areas to protect around Geneva to secure a provision of ecosystem services and protect biodiversity. But it's also interesting because the prioritization tool we use identify also the less important areas, that the cold spot, which could be useful to also identify areas if we need to develop some infrastructure, better do it in those cold spots than in hotspot of biodiversity. And now we just finishing a mandate through the greater Geneva area to expand this approach that we did for the cantonal state Swiss area towards a greater region that encompass French department, Haute-Savoie, and part of Vaud state. So extend to another scale this approach to define the best 30% of the ecological infrastructure at a larger scale. So this is all good, and really I was very happy to be able to develop these methods with bringing all this information through maps and prioritization, but it's not enough. What we need to do really is to be able to integrate a lot of different things to assess the socio-ecological system again. We are looking here, essentially, I was presenting essentially how we can protect biodiversity, but there are other SDGs at stake, and they are all under pressure of different population, climate, land use change scenarios. And we need tools as the ecosystem services, as the planetary boundaries, as the ecological footprint, and as the Nexus that I will be talking about that integrate all this information to make progresses. So the Nexus that I want to talk about is usually defined as food, water, and energy Nexus, but we can expand it to climate and ecosystem as I did in my title. And the idea is that these it's the environment, nature, that provides the supply of resources that we need to make our society function for our livelihood, that create a demand on these resources, and we can pretend to be sustainable only if the demand doesn't overpass the natural system. So we can look at this Nexus, sorry, and it's important to look through a Nexus because there are a lot of interaction between food, water, and energy sectors. And we need water for agriculture, we need energy for agriculture, we need food for agriculture has an impact on water, and so on and so forth. So it's difficult to study one without the others. So Professor Mario Giampietro from the University of Barcelona has proposed a method, a tool to assess this so-called socio-ecological system, and looking at the relationship between the environment and what it provides in terms of resources and ecosystem services, and how our societies create waste and emissions, and looking at how the system function internally and what are the dependencies on the environment, the environmental pressures. So in order to do that, he put up his methods to assess the use that we have of different flows, water, energy, food, and also how we use land use or labor time in each of these different activities or households, but also services, mobility, industry, and so on. You can define whatever sector you want to look at. And you need to do it in your area under study, your city, for instance, but you need also to think about externalities that were already mentioned and how our export and imports are, of course, impacting the environment elsewhere. So every activity that we have can be defined as with a small process like this, where we look at what we take from nature and what we put back in nature as pollutants. And then if you can do it from one activity, the agricultural sector, you can also do it for the building sector or the tertiary service sector or for your house. And you have an entire footprint of a full society that you can sum up and have a metabolic assessment of your system. So we tried that with a master student in Geneva. Mario Giampietro has done it in Barcelona and in many other regions of the world. And we had to define what we wanted to measure in terms of primary, secondary, tertiary sectors and private households, and then different activities. And you can define this hierarchy of activities to the level of definition for which you have data. And then you put it back as a matrix. with all these activity on the left as rows, and then the flows and fund that you want to assess, electricity, gas, oil. Here we had water and energy, and then what it creates in terms, for instance, of GDP or CO2 emission or other pollutants. So it's a long endeavor. It's very hard to go and find the data, but it's possible. A master student did it for Geneva here and could assess the total amount of electricity, gas, petrol, water used in the different sectors here. So the number here corresponds to the total amount of a resource being used. And then here, it's the same value, but divided by the time we spent on each of these activity, human activity, which gives you a ratio which can be assessed as a metabolic pattern and can be compared from one country to another, from one city to another. It makes it comparable. So once we have that, we looked at plausible scenarios that has been defined for Geneva, business as usual, or different kind of scenarios that has been defined. And you can translate this present matrix and look according to the different scenarios how the metabolic pattern could or should change and what would be the impact on the intensity of use of resources and possible pollutants. So you try to transform here, for instance, in terms of graphically, this business as usual pretty much results in an increase in every use of resources, also economical values, but also CO2 emissions, where a more sustainable future, reducing essentially petrol use would be much better. So in conclusion to all of this, somehow we live in a world, I think, and it was mentioned, where it's very difficult for decision makers to know exactly what is happening. It's like if you are entering a plane and you look in the cockpit and you see the pilots having just a speedometer GDP and then dies when they don't know where to go. What we like to see is something a bit more complex to drive a plane, and there's a lot of elements to take into account. And I think that in order to drive our societies towards a sustainable future, we also need a much more detailed dashboard where we are along these different elements. So in conclusions, yeah, ecosystem services is useful, but the anthropocentric concept, we have the data and tools to evaluate them. We know also where to protect them, but it's not enough. Whatever the approach we look at with planetary boundaries, ecological footprint, Nexus, whatever, we realize that we are exceeding the ability of nature to regenerate to the natural capital that we need. And I think the Nexus is a good potential approach to really integrate all this information and drive useful information for SDG policies. So I will stop here with some references and maybe a few links also, especially on a MOOC that Mario Gianpietro has done on Coursera. If the methods that I presented interest you, you can follow this on Coursera. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anthony, for this presentation that, like the first one is in this morning, emphasize the need of good data to have good tools for politics decisions. So is there any question for Anthony?
Thank you for your presentation. I don't know if you hear me well, if I speak.
I do.
Okay, great. So definitely there's a big interest in performance assessment, and there's a lot of, I mean, most of the European call now requires you provide tools to have performance assessment of all the mitigation measures that you are going to implement, especially if you're going for the Nexus approach. So my question is, do we have enough feedback? Because this kind of interest is quite recent. do we have enough feedback to say that the current methods for performance assessment are efficient, or actually we are still in the progress of defining what models or what kind of tools we have to implement?
Yeah, I wish I could pass your question to Mario Giampietro, who is the developer of this approach that I present here, Museasm it's called, and has been spending most of his career developing it. And in fact, he was running a European project, Magic Nexus, which allowed to compare every European countries in terms of their metabolic patterns like this. So I think he demonstrated, also he did it for Barcelona, so that his approach at least is feasible, but it remains complex. It needs a lot of data and a good understanding of the different kinds of data that is needed to assess like this food, water, energy together, and even more. And so it remains complex, but and there are other methods, of course, to do kind of similar approaches. Yeah, I think for me the biggest limitation has been to encourage. We're developing it now for the Geneva state, but I have trouble finding policymakers that would like to engage in such complex approach. Because they need kind of quick fix solution, and they don't want to think holistically about the complexity of the system.
Other questions? So Anthony, I was just curious. So a master project in Geneva is still 1 year?
Yes.
So it took 1 year to grasp this data and fill the tables, right?
Yes, yes.
For Geneva. So like for Switzerland or Europe, how much time will it require? And is it feasible to find this data?
It's obviously feasible. Now I managed to have a PhD student funded to look at the metabolic patterns of the greater Geneva region, and we started with food and agriculture to complement what was done here. But it's a lot of work, and it's clearly, I mean, we are doing research, so we are testing it and talking with policymakers and trying to see how and they could potentially implement it. But ideally, this should be done by every company. We should have something like this to assess our own life, how our houses are functioning. We should know how much water, energy, and especially we see when it's almost free or cheap, nobody cares. But as soon as it becomes more expensive, we can start looking at where we could save. And it's something we could or should need at every scale of decisions, from a communal to a national or European level. It's feasible, but again, it's a question of effort and investment.
Okay. One last question. Oh, I thought everyone was hungry.
Me too.
Okay, so I'll be long. No. So yeah, that's really interesting. I was impressed by the number of variables you have to deal with, and they're extremely different variables, right? Some are monetary, some are ecological, some are. And so I was wondering, how do you deal with that level of complexity in some ways to convince yourself that at one point, okay, you have figured out which ones are really key? How do you, it's my thing, how do you find uncertainties, or you run in the past? Or I was curious how you get your confidence.
Yeah. Well, the way the method is put forward by the Mario Giampietro is environmental accounting. It's not kind of complex modeling structure like we might have in climate modeling or hydrological modeling with equations that we try to fit. This is taking the available numbers, putting it in the right box, and you can define your own hierarchy of sectors that you want to look at. Some you might want to just have the gross numbers. Others you are more interested in mobility or agriculture, and then you define further and further, and you have data for it. So you are flexible to do that. And yeah, obviously you can find the data, and in the end you get this metabolic patterns that you can modify, and for instance use it to explore what it would mean to move from you mentioned it, I think, diesel engine cars to electric cars for a city. How much CO2 you would save, or how much petrol you would also not use, and so on and so forth. So it's relatively simple. It's not really looking at complex modeling approach for uncertainty, but of course, behind all this data, there is obviously uncertainty.
Thank you, Anthony. We will finish this session here. Thank you to the 4 nice talk that we have, the interesting questions. And for the lunch information, I pass the microphone to Hélène.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for the speakers of this morning session.